Hello, I'm Eleanor, and welcome to this video essay, Deadly Premonition 2 and Commedia dell'Arte. There will be some spoilers ahead. In fact, there'll be quite a few spoilers ahead, so if you've never played Deadly Premonition or its sequel, I would advise doing that first, especially the first game. It's very, very interesting and much better if you come to it spoiler-free. But for the rest of us who know what this madness is all about, on we go. So, a quick intro. Deadly Premonition, the first game, was originally released in 2010 for Xbox 360 and PS3. It features psychic detective Francis York Morgan, who has to travel to the town of Greenvale, Washington State, to solve a series of bizarre, gruesome murders carried out by a maniac in a red raincoat. Of course, York is particularly well equipped to solve these murders because he has the ability to shift into an other world, a dark and twisted version of the real world, and in this other world he's able to pick up clues and use a form of psychometry to relive the events of the crime. Unfortunately, in order to do this, he also has to battle his way past various otherworldly nasties who try to stop him reaching these clues. The game was created by Hidetaka Sweriro, also known as Swery65, who's also created such games as Spy Fiction and D4 Dark Dreams Don't Die. Deadly Premonition received a lot of criticism at the time for its dated graphics, even by 2010 standards. However, it did also famously receive a hugely enthusiastic 10 out of 10 review in Destructoid by James Stephanie Sterling, who praised the game's sense of humour, which she memorably described as, quote, like watching two clowns eat each other, unquote, which is such a striking image I just had to include it, and its relevance will become very soon clear. In 2019, Deadly Premonition received a sequel for Nintendo Switch, Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise, in which a younger Francis York Morgan travels to the town of Le Carre, Louisiana, to solve the murder of Lise Clarkson, a young girl who has been ritually dismembered and whose corpse has subsequently been stolen. It's an interesting game in its own right, though I don't think it quite lives up to the first. However, it, like the first, came in for its share of harsh criticism, in particular a review in Slant magazine, which described it as a janky navel-gazing exercise. To each their own, but I take particular issue with one part of their criticism directed towards the enemies you face in the game. Quote, the demonic pains that York faces in the other world, all inexplicably named after stock characters from Commedia dell'Arte, unquote. I'm going to investigate that claim because, while the naming is certainly true, I'm not sure it's inexplicable. There are valid criticisms to be made of Deadly Premonition 2. The dungeons are much duller than in the first game, and they were never the highlight in that, but they're particularly dull in the second game. They're just generic corridor shootouts. They go on for far too long. It's like a bad 80s episode of Doctor Who sometimes. The loading time for the open world is really, really going to try your patience. And though the frame rate has been improved, there's still a fair bit of stutter. Some of the humour doesn't quite come off. There's a guy who will waffle on about pizza a lot. I think the writer's intent there is to try that old Simpsons premise of if you carry on the joke for long enough, it'll stop being funny, then get funny again. But in my mind, it never gets funny again with this guy. But on the other hand, a lot of the jokes in the game did have me laughing out loud, so still overall a win. But the idea that Swery is just doing some things for pretension, I definitely take issue with. I'm linking to an article on Access Games blog where Swery talks at length about the first game, and you can see the amount of thought and storytelling that's gone into it. So I would like to take a serious look at these references in the second game and see if there's a purpose to them. I freely admit, be using a fair bit of Wikipedia, but there are other sources listed just so we can be professional-ish about this. So, let's have a look at Commedia dell'Arte to begin with. Right, so there are many resources on Commedia dell'Arte, but for now I'll read from Britannica.com. Quote, Commedia dell'Arte, Italian theatrical form that flourished throughout Europe from the 16th through the 18th century. Outside Italy, the form had its greatest success in France, where it became the Comédie Italienne In England, elements from it were naturalised in the harlequinade in pantomime and in the Punch and Judy show, a puppet play involving the Commedia dell'Arte character Punch. More on him later. So, moving on a little, it was a form of popular theatre that emphasised ensemble acting. It had improvisations set in a firm framework of masks and stock situations, and its plots were frequently borrowed from the classical literary tradition, of the commedia erudita, or the literary drama. Professional players who specialised in one role developed an unmatched comic acting technique which contributed to the popularity of the itinerant commedia troupes that travelled throughout Europe. So, travelling theatre, and not a highbrow form of entertainment. This was popular entertainment. So, many attempts have been made to find the form's origins in pre-classical and classical mime and farce, including the Atellan farces of Rome and the plays of Plautus, their possible origins of it, although they are disputed. So, what we have here is something with plenty of comic action, physical action, somewhat subversive, popular and entertaining. This is entertainment for the masses, very physical and very energetic. And it's not trying to tell a high literary art form, it's using stock plots. So, well-worn devices, these are a vehicle for the performers, rather than the performers trying to tell a particularly noteworthy story. It's much more in the performance. So, reading again from Britannica.com, the typical Commedia dell'Arte scenario involved a young couple's love being thwarted by their parents. The scenario used symmetrical pairs of characters, 2 elderly men, 2 lovers, 2 zanni, or servants, a maidservant, a soldier, and extras, unquote. So, stock plots, stock characters, broad stereotypes. And the stereotypes, they also fall into broader categories. First category, and I'm reading from clownlink.com now, the vecchio, the old men. So these are the masters. They are the people who have servants, who the servants often act on behalf of, and in the process often mess everything up. They are archetypes and stock characters, but they also have their own little quirks based on the actors that played them and who imbued them with such characteristics. So these are the authority figures, the figures with money, the figures in control. They are funny, but they're not consciously funny. They're funny because of their failings and because of their misfortunes. So, alongside them we have the servants, the zanni. So, quoting again, zanni are the class of servants that are on the bottom of the food chain. They are porters, servants, and lower-class citizens who serve their masters' harebrained schemes, bungle their own harebrained schemes, and once in a long while make out like bandits, only to have their loot pulled away from them at the last second. Zanni apparently is a shortening of the name Giovanni, which is a way of making a socio-economic racial insult. It's as if you were American in San Francisco in the 1860s and you called all of the Chinese construction workers Chang, apparently. It's also where we get the word zany from. So there are many of these characters, but they are all servants, lower-class types. They are the driving force of the action. They are the most proactive characters in the play. And at the other extreme, we have the innamorati. So, quoting clownlink.com again, the Commedia lovers were the only unmasked characters in the show. They were the plot engines behind the stories. Their love story was what drove the elderly characters, the vecchio characters, to war, the zanni characters to create all kinds of crazy plots and tricks, and when all else failed, their joining is what would constitute the happy ending of the play, unquote. So, they're more plot devices than people. They are the straight men in a way. Although they were, quote, as comic and flawed as any of the other characters, they were in love with being in love, vain, thoughtless, changed emotions on a whim, and could be cruel and callous while professing the most profound of loves, unquote. So probably you'd think the least interesting characters in it, but necessary because they give the excuse for the plot to be there at all. We'll turn to the game in a second, but first I just want to cover a couple of ways in which this theatrical genre evolved and endured. We've mentioned the Harlequinade, now quoting from jester.fandom.com. This is a British comic theatrical genre which developed in England between the 17th and mid-19th centuries, and it was originally a slapstick adaptation or variant of the Commedia dell'Arte. Its story revolves around a comic incident in the lives of its 5 main characters: Harlequin, who loves Columbine, Columbine's greedy and foolish father Pantaloon, who tries to separate the lovers in league with the mischievous clown, and the servant Piero, usually involving chaotic chase scenes with a bumbling policeman. It was originally a silent mime act with music and stylized dance. It later employed some dialogue, but remained primarily a visual spectacle. An often elaborate magical transformation scene presided over by a fairy connected the unrelated stories. That's something we will definitely come back to in relation to Deadly Premonition 2. Another famous derivation of the Commedia dell'Arte, especially to British people, is Punch and Judy, the seaside extravaganza of puppets committing horrendous violence against each other for laughs. Now, the character of Punch, according to World Encyclopedia of Puppetry Arts, was first introduced into England by Italian puppeteer Pietro Gimond and was derived from the zany character Pulcinella of the Commedia dell'Arte. So it's been in various forms historically as a rod puppet and a marionette before it became a glove puppet. And quoting again, the glove puppet show retained many features of the marionette play. Punch was accompanied by a shrewish English wife, Joan, whom he regularly beat. He was carried off by the devil at the end of the show, but by the end of the 18th century, he was beginning to conquer even the devil. Unquote. Rather a subversive character. In earlier versions, he was condemned to be hanged, but now in later versions, he was getting the hangman to put his own head into the noose. Bit of a revolutionary in a rather selfish way, which is consistent with the Italian Pulcinella character, incidentally. And Joan changed her name to Judy by 1818 for unknown reasons, and she had a baby whom Punch threw out of the window. He's a nice lad, isn't he? Well, there we go, and more on him later. A couple of smaller derivations. One of the most popular characters in the Commedia dell'Arte was the zany character Arlecchino, otherwise known as Harlequin. And though I don't expect any of the actors back then would have imagined he would endure for the ages as a sexy Batman villainess, well, there you go. Also, the character Pantalone, one of the Vecchio, the old men, he's given us the name of Trousers, because the red hose that he wore became known as pantaloons, which in French is pantalon, and now they're just pants. So, well, if you're American, they're trousers. If you're British, obviously, it just doesn't make any sense at all. But there you go. And now onto the game. Though technically there are 6 types of dungeon enemy in the sequel, in reality it boils down to 3 types with a slightly stronger palette swap for each of them. Not many, in other words. And furthermore, they're introduced sequentially, 1 new enemy for each subsequent dungeon, so in the first dungeon you're actually effectively only fighting 1 enemy, which does get pretty dull. I said the dungeons are not the highlight of the game. That said, the designs of the enemies are actually quite interesting and at least initially disturbing. So we have Psycho Scissor Lads, introduced in Galena's dungeon, Angry Door Boys, introduced in Lena's dungeon, the Creepy Stripper Ladies, introduced in the 3rd dungeon, which is it Avery's dungeon? Is it Zack's dungeon? I don't know, maybe a bit of both there. These dungeons are certainly hinted to be manifested from the mind of the boss. In the 2nd dungeon, Lena Clarkson's, York describes the experience as being inside Lena's mind. And our most explicit hint towards this is given by Aaliyah Davis in episode 4, when she talks about Galena Clarkson having a fear of scissors due to having been bullied in Hollywood, having her clothes and her hair cut by her co-workers. And this is such a clear reflection of the very scissor-themed enemies in her dungeon that it's worth examining all of the dungeon baddies with the same principle in mind. How could the angry doorboys reflect Lena's fears? Well, they are a good symbol of entrapment, imprisonment. Their voice samples, though they're not easy to hear, they seem to be saying things like, never be free. And they attack with those little exploding crab things. Explosives relate to Lena. She uses a bomb. She's often mentioned as having a good understanding of fire dynamics. The creepy stripper ladies, they seem to thrive on a fear of powerlessness. They're always taunting the player with weakness. Their attacks inflict sickness and colds. That could be related to Avery, his low self-esteem, the fact that he works in the cold storage warehouse. But of course they could also relate to Zack and his own fears and his own sense of frailty and the fact that he is dying at the end of the game. So, on that level, they are suitable metaphors, but what about their Commedia connections? Well, let's look at them one at a time, weakest enemy to strongest. The lowest tier of angry scissor lads are known as Capitanos. Now, Il Capitano, in the Commedia dell'Arte, is a soldier, or at least that's what he wants us to think that he is. Quoting from Wikipedia, though, he most likely was never a captain, but rather appropriated the name for himself. He is often a braggart and a swaggerer who can maintain his claims only by benefit of the fact that none of the locals know him. He's usually a Spaniard, unquote, so he's an outsider. He talks big, but he doesn't seem to have much to show for it. Now, turning to italymask.co.nz, he's vainglorious, deceitful, and a braggart soldier dressed in a bright and colourful uniform, unquote. A showy person. But again, he doesn't have anything to back it up with. Quote, his part usually involves him boasting of great exploits of war, but he is the subject of pranks and jokes from the other characters, unquote. No respect for Il Capitano. Quote again, he sometimes responds to this by unsheathing his sword, but the only blood that is ever spilt is his own, unquote. So, an outsider who talks big but doesn't deliver on it. And someone like that who's close to Galena Clarkson, maybe. I'm afraid. Daniel Clarkson, step forward, please. He's a very good fit for this role. He is constantly living in the shadow of PJ. He's not a coward, at least as far as we know, but he still can't really deliver on the big threats he's always making, and he gets no respect, and indeed the only blood that is spilt is his own. I mean, no one can blame him for not wanting to give his arm to that alligator, but still. He never, ever gets to inflict that sort of harm on anyone. He is totally the subject of punishment himself. So, Il Capitano is rather well covered as a stock type in this game. That instantly throws cold water on the idea that the Commedia references are meaningless. But let's continue to the next one, which is a more complex type. Moving on to the higher tier of the Psycho Scissor Lads, we next have Pulcinella, the Commedia stock character who evolved into the English Punch. And looking at his description on Wikipedia, we can instantly see the resemblance to the grotesque creature in the dungeons. Quote, his visual appearance includes a humpback, a crooked nose, gangly legs, a pot-belly, large cheeks, and a gigantic mouth, unquote. No scissors, but still. Quoting again, these traits were inherited from two stock characters of the Roman Italian farce. He typically wears a pointed hat, and notably he can be a member of the Vecchi or the Zanni characters. When he's a member of the Vecchi, the upper class, he is a cunning thief and a schemer. When depicted as a member of the Zanni, the servants, he's a perverted bumpkin. In either case, he is a social climber, striving to rise above his station in life. He's an opportunist who sides with the winner in any situation and fears no consequences. His main motivations are self-interest and self-preservation, yet Pulcinella also tends to rescue other characters from trouble. He is said to be every character's savior, despite acting as a rebel and a delinquent. That's very, very ambivalent. Says he represents the soul of the people and its primitive instincts. He almost always appears in contradiction, does not have any fixed traits. He may be rich or poor, a bully or a coward, sometimes exhibiting both traits simultaneously. This contradiction is enforced in the description on World Encyclopedia of Puppetry Arts. Quote, the transgressive character par excellence associated with the figure of the devil, just like the English Punch character is. Pulcinella obeys his master but can also defy him. Usually penniless, this sly rascal develops myriad stratagems for achieving his aims and gorging himself, but under Columbina's tender gaze he is also a pitiable and sympathetic fool. That's interesting. The innocent victim of his powerful enemies. He frequently transforms himself, taking on a variety of roles, but without ever renouncing the essentially populist identity that he expresses in multiple dialects. His insolence and devilry are also balanced by the qualities of a generous saviour in the service of the greater good. What a strange and interesting character, but how do we tie this into the game? So, we have associations: domestic violence, rebellion, the devil. Well, it's a game about a black magic cult in service to a devilish figure. But which figures of this cult best fit that description? I think you could have some grounds for saying Galena herself could be a bit of a Pulcinella figure. She's a social climber, a would-be actress. Like Punch, or some versions of the Pulcinella character, she has a violent streak to her, certainly. However, I think another cult member is an even stronger fit, and this would be the first candidate for the title of Fool King, namely poor Melvin. Of course, Melvin initially seems innocent, but Melvin is a walking contradiction. As it later turns out, he is very ambivalent and dangerous. He has a strong clown theme. If you take a look at the livery on the side of his van, it's screaming at you almost in the same way that George, the sheriff's license plate, is screaming at you in the first game to look out for this person. Back to Melvin, though, he has a bumbling personality, but he plays it up. York even draws attention to the fact that he plays this up when he starts to suspect Melvin. And, though it might be a slight stretch, his costume does, when he becomes the priest of the Red Tree, those loose white robes and the mask with the rather prominent nose outline on it, it has a certain Punch-like quality to it. Now, another association with Punch, notable to film buffs, which might include York himself for all we know, is the 1972 film The Wicker Man, in which the protagonist, rather bumbling policeman Sergeant Howie, ends up dressed in a Punch costume in order to infiltrate a pagan ceremony, which it unfortunately transpires that he is the intended victim of. I'm now going to read from Dr. Melissa Smith's article on The Wicker Man. So, quote, further complicating the use of Punch in The Wicker Man is the idea of the scapegoat derived from one of the film's sources, James Fraser's The Golden Bough, 1890 to 1922. Although there are many examples of scapegoating discussed in Fraser's study, of particular interest is a custom practiced by the Greeks of Asia Minor in the 6th century BCE. When a city suffered from plague, famine, or other public calamity, an ugly or deformed person was chosen to take upon himself all the evils which afflicted the community. He was beaten 7 times upon his genital organs with squills and branches of the wild fig and other wild trees, while the flutes played a particular tune. Afterwards he was burned on a pyre built of the wood of forest trees, and his ashes were cast into the sea. The use of a physically deformed individual as scapegoat offers a partial explanation for the use of the Punch costume in The Wicker Man, since its twisted facial features and hunchback give Howie the deformed appearance of this type of sacrificial victim. Unquote. And of course, as we eventually learn in the game, as the protagonists piece together, Melvin was never the one carrying out the sacrifice. He was intended to be the scapegoat, the one who would be sacrificed, so that Patricia would inherit. So the Fool King is only king for a day, like Sergeant Howie in The Wicker Man. But, of course, unlike Sergeant Howie, Melvin, in the end, willingly sacrifices himself. And that brings us back to the theme of Pulcinella as being ultimately a saviour, a hero character. He is redeemed. Not that there's any way Galena could have known that, but the parallel is still quite dramatic. And the idea of him being softened by Columbine, well, that's going to be interesting when we start examining Columbine. But first we have to go through the Angry Door Boys. Moving on to the second dungeon, Lena Clarkson's, and the Angry Door Boys. The first of these, the low tier one, is called Pantalone, and the character in Commedia dell'Arte with whom he shares his name is one of the Vecchi, the upper class characters, and this one is particularly high ranked. The Pantalone is a rich merchant type. Quoting from Wikipedia, his character is entirely based on currency and ego. He has the highest regard for his intelligence, but at every step he becomes the butt for every conceivable kind of trick. He's the metaphorical representation of money in the Commedia world. He's usually the father to one of the lover characters, the Innamorati, and is often driven to keep his child and their respective lover apart. He is presented as either a widower or a bachelor alone in the world. He never forgets a deal, he is petty, and he never forgets or forgives. He loves money, has emotional extremes, and has sinister and often inhumane treatment towards his fellows. Now moving over to commediadell'arte.weebly.com. So he has spent a lifetime saving all his money and doesn't want to spend it. Again, he's usually the father to one or more of the Innamorati, wants to make money, appear rich and powerful. Often tries to actually marry the young players, the Innamorati, if it betters his financial state, so wants his children to marry advantageously. Yet he's not evil, and he usually gives in to his children's wants by the end. So, very concerned with appearances, wants to appear strong and masculine and powerful, but he's compromised. He's not as powerful as he wants to be. Maybe he's declined from some heights. Is there a character in Lena's life who fits this? I think we're going to have to say P.J. Clarkson. Certainly he seems intimidating at first, but his final boss status, as York initially mistakes him for, is soon revealed to be completely false. He is utterly bested by Lena Clarkson, and of course his final action is to apologize for having ruined her life with his own selfish desires to create a legacy. And he is, like Pantalone, petty and control-freakish, yet out of his depth and ultimately afraid, as he confesses to York in the dungeon sequences. And returning again to the pains and how they reflect the fears of the boss that manifested the dungeon, Lena's big anxiety is that she will be forever trapped by the Clarkson legacy, the Clarkson curse as she thinks of it, that she will never be able to fully break away from it, and so she in the end resorts to murder-suicide. And the Pantalone character in the game, or rather, well, not a character, the Pantalone enemy in the game, constantly taunting the player character with thoughts of entrapment and imprisonment, that's very well works very well as a reflection of Lena's anxieties. Moving up a tier, the next enemy type we encounter is Arlecchino. This name, Harlequin in English, relates to another of the Zanni characters, the lower class characters. And like the previous Zanni character, Pulcinella, he's a very proactive character, a real mover of the plot, source of action and comedy, another very strong contender for the title of Fool King. Also, like Pulcinella, this character has endured and evolved over the years, so I'm going to read from a few different sources to grasp some of the dimensions of this character. From italymask.co.nz, Arlecchino is a bit of a dimwit, silly, simple-minded, and perpetually hungry. His usual role is faithful valet or servant, but he's also the clown, the acrobat, providing lots of comic relief. As soon as he appears on stage, there is always lots of laughter at his absurd antics and words, alternating between flashes of brilliance and plain idiocy. You can't predict which will manifest itself at any time. This is overlaid with wit and charm, as well as scheming to meet his own objectives, so quite an unpredictable character. While undertaking errands for his master or pursuing a pretty lady or both, he gets into all manner of strife. He employs every technique he can to achieve his objectives, including pretending to be a soldier or a woman. His absent-mindedness is legendary. He can be looking for the chair he is sitting on or completely sidetracked by a pretty lady, money or food. All the while, his boundless energy is causing his supple body to undertake somersaults, handstands, cartwheels, and all sorts of acrobatic feats. Understandably, he was loved by audiences. So, very, very energetic character, but at the same time, easily sidetracked. So, having a look at a different source now, this is just poshmasks.com, and this demonstrates how he evolved. In the early days of the Commedia, the mid-16th century, he was portrayed as slow-witted and poor, forever hungry and desperate for money. But by the early 17th century, he had become guileful, brazen, and always in high spirits, and a master of disguises. No longer the pathetic clown, he has become increasingly shrewd, able to thwart the plans of his master, manages to extricate himself from problematic affairs with growing wit and resourcefulness. He is now seen as a romantic hero rather than a blundering half-wit. Move on a little. He has a reputation as a mysterious devil with trickster qualities, though he bears no ill will towards those who treat him in a beastly fashion, so that's interesting. He is a trickster figure now. You can also see this characterization on Commedia dell'Arte.weebly.com. He is a trickster and a fool. He likes to trick the Vecchi so that couples can be married. He is nimble and quick. He would prefer to exit by somersault than by just walking out. So, what are we looking for here? We're looking for a character who is ambivalent, witty, zany, somewhat obsessed with food, sometimes brilliant, sometimes a complete idiot, and who is easily sidetracked, athletic, energetic. Let's just face it, this is York. This is the character in the game who is not only our protagonist and driving force, but will let himself get sidetracked into doing skateboard tricks or starving himself half to death just so that he can improve the taste of a meal. And let us not forget that York is the prime candidate for the title of Fool King. Yeah, it is definitely York. Hungan possibly has some of that trickster quality as well, but Lena has no reason to include Hungan into her dungeon landscapes, and we know Lena had factored York into her plans, so it makes a lot more sense for York to be the Harlequin archetype. There's another thing that is worth mentioning about Harlequin. In the later years, after Commedia dell'Arte was out of fashion, some characters and tropes did actually survive in other forms, not just Punch and Judy. There is an English comic theatrical genre called the Harlequinade. If we look at the character of Harlequin as it evolved in this, the comedian and the romantic male lead, servant and love interest of Columbine, everlasting high spirits and cleverness, and this is important, he is able to perform magic feats in the Harlequinade. He uses his slapstick, which is a prop he retains from the Commedia dell'Arte, to transform the scene from the pantomime into the Harlequinade and magically change the settings to various locations during the chase scene. Now, of all the characters in the game, who is most associated with magical scene changing? It's got to be York. And, well, Lena, who seems to have some awareness of the other world, is in a position to know that, so it fits very well. There is one other character, though, who Lena was aware of, and who has a facility for magical scene changing, and that would be York's spiritual and moral antithesis, Forrest Kaysen, the villain. And let us not forget that Forrest is quite theatrical. In fact, he even lures you into a theatre for the final boss fight in the first game. He's surprisingly athletic. He does a lot of bouncing and tumbling during his boss fights. It would be safe to say he is a villainous variant on the Harlequin type, but still York is absolutely our prime candidate. On to the third and final dungeon, and the new enemy type it introduces, namely the creepy stripper ladies. The low tier one of these is Columbina. This refers to another of the Zanni characters in the Commedia dell'Arte, one we've already referred to a couple of times. World Encyclopedia of Puppetry Arts referred to her as bringing out the best in the Pulcinella figure, having a very softening and positive influence. The Harlequinade, the later English evolution of Commedia dell'Arte, had a character called Columbine, who was the daughter of Pantaloon and the lover of Harlequin. That's going to be an interesting point, but let's have a look at the original character in Commedia dell'Arte first. So, IPL.org describes her as the wisest and the most rational character. With a quick wit and unabashed, flirtatious personality, she brings a strong female aura to the mix. She's smart, sharp, self-educated, and oozes confidence, never afraid to keep her fellow male counterparts in check. So, a rare voice of reason in this clownish spectacle. We also get that on tvtropes.org, which describes Columbina as often the smartest, sanest person in the play. And if we look at italymask.co.nz, it also reinforces her connection with Arlecchino, the best friend and the sometimes lover of. So who could this refer to? We're looking for a voice of reason, a check on the male characters, a positive influence, connections to the Harlequin figure. Aaliyah Davis is a very slight fit. She certainly aspires to be a voice of reason, although she comes across mainly as just being out of her depth. But her connection to Harlequin is tenuous at best. Zack is not really the Harlequin, York is the Harlequin, and Aaliyah really never, ever really encounters York in any meaningful sense. Besides which, there's a character who's a much better fit, and that would be Patricia. So what is the reasoning behind this choice? Well, for one thing, she has all of the right connections. She's related to the Pantaloon figure, albeit as granddaughter rather than daughter. She is the constant companion of the Harlequin figure, namely York, going with him on all of his adventures and eventually becoming a good friend of his. She is also connected to the Pulcinella figure, namely Melvin, our other Fool King, and she has a positive redeeming influence on him, transforming him from villain into savior by appealing to his better emotions. Beyond that, she is a definite voice of reason. She's cynical and witty, especially when it comes to a certain The Lord Hunger's quest. She offers a check on the zaniness of the male characters. And as for her business for being in that dungeon with those bosses, she has a definite connection to both Zack and Avery. Zack as a gallant savior, or would-be savior, and Avery as a, well, really creepy necrophiliac obsession. So, I would say she's a much likelier fit than Aaliyah. On to the final enemy of the game, the Innamorata, the high-tier crazy stripper lady, named for the Innamorati characters in the Commedia, the young lovers. Now, while the amours of this pair could be said to provide the excuse for the plot of the comedy, they could scarcely be said to be the main characters. We could compare them to characters such as Claudio and Hero in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, or Jane Bennet and Charles Bingley in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. They are, in a sense, the principal characters. They're certainly set up as such, but in the end, they're quite passive, and they certainly hold our interest much less than supposedly secondary but more charismatic characters such as Beatrice and Benedict from Much Ado, and Darcy and Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice. They are as much plot device as they are characters in their own right. They are almost a MacGuffin. So we are looking for not necessarily a character here, because there is no sort of stock romance plot in Deadly Premonition 2. There is, however, a creepy necrophiliac pseudo-romance, and we can find a character in here who is so much absent for the duration of the game that she is more plot device than person, and that is the body of Lise Clarkson, the dismembered cadaver, which indeed ties together the two halves of the plot, as its disappearance serves as the reason for Zack to fall under investigation again after the events of the Le Carré case in 2005. There is, however, another character who could be argued to be kind of an inamorata type, and that is Zack. As we find out in episode 4, Zack is still obsessed many, many years after the event with having failed to save his true love, Emily Wyatt, in the first game. This continues to haunt him. Forrest Kaysen uses it to taunt him and to briefly trick him into becoming a thrall of the Red World. And Zack, we must remember, of course, is not the same character as York. He is, in a sense, York unmasked. Importantly, the inamorata characters in the Commedia performed unmasked, uniquely out of all the characters. And without his mask, or without his faithful Zanny character, his Arlecchino character, Zack is very vulnerable and subject to all sorts of powerful outside forces. Just like the young lovers in the comedy, he's not the one in control. He needs his outside help to get him through. As a quick aside, I just want to turn to a certain Carl Jung, whom you may have heard of. Reading here from verywellmind.com. Born in Switzerland in 1875, Carl Jung founded the School of Analytical Psychology. He worked with Sigmund Freud in his early years, but eventually diverged from him on the subject of the unconscious or subconscious mind. Their difference was that Freud believed it was the product of personal experiences, while Jung believed that the subconscious was inherited from the past collective experience of humanity, and thus we get his famous theory of the collective unconscious. According to Jung, the collective unconscious is made up of a collection of knowledge and imagery that every person is born with and is shared by all human beings due to ancestral experience. Though humans may not know what thoughts and images are in their collective unconscious, it is thought that in moments of crisis, the psyche can tap into it. And if you're a Deadly Premonition fan, you're probably immediately feeling a sense of deja vu there. That is very much how the other world in Deadly Premonition often seems to work. And while the other world initially seems to be a purely subjective experience for York himself, as the game goes on, we later find other characters interfacing with it. Emily goes into the other world late in the game. George, in his raincoat killer form, of course, has been in there and encountered York in there, as you will know from various painful QuickTime events. In the second game, York experiences surprise when, in Lena's dungeon, he encounters the spirit of PJ Clarkson. And that is also quite similar to the moments in the first game when Harry Stewart, the mysterious capitalist who presides over Greenvale, turns up in York's other world. How he appears there is never fully explained, but it does seem that the other world is something that connects all people. There is another aspect of Jung's thinking, which is relevant here, and he believed that the collective unconscious is expressed through universal archetypes. Archetypes are signs, symbols, or patterns of thinking and or behavior that are inherited from our ancestors. According to Jung, these mythological images or cultural symbols are not static or fixed. Many different archetypes may overlap or combine at any given time, but some common archetypes that Jung proposed for explaining the unconscious mind include the anima and the animus, that is either the idealized feminine in the male psyche or the idealized masculine in the female psyche, which is quite interesting when you think about the transgender themes in the game. You've got two prominent trans characters, Thomas in the first game and Lena Clarkson in the second game. Another archetype, the hero character, starting with a humble birth, then overcoming evil and death. Well, I think there's a fairly obvious hero in the game. Won't even elaborate on that. the persona archetype, the mask we use to conceal our inner selves to the outside world. There's quite a lot of masking and concealment in the games, both literally, say with Harry Stewart and his gas mask, and, of course, York and Zack, where the mask and the person are, well, it's hard to say which is which sometimes, though I'd say normally York is serving in the role of the mask. The persona. The next archetype here, the self, the whole of the personality, the core of the total psyche. The next one, very interesting, the shadow. That's a term you hear a lot in the games, the shadow, the psyche's immoral and dark aspects. That ties in very well to the Red World and its entities, which are all a dark and twisted reflection of the real world, especially in the first game. Next archetype, the trickster. Well, that suits the theme of the second game with all these clowns and Commedia types extremely well. This character is described as the child seeking self-gratification, sometimes being cruel and unfeeling in the process. Honestly, that could describe a fair few characters in the game. York, to an extent, though, York is ultimately a force for good. He admits to being selfish in some ways, and he's very, very easily sidetracked, and he can be inconsiderate, but his heart's still in the right place. However, there are much more harmful, childish characters, notably George and Melvin. And finally, we have here the wise old man. Not so many of these in the games, though I'd argue Harry Stewart fits that archetype quite well, the self as a figure of wisdom or knowledge. Now, I have no proof at all that Swery has included Jungian themes in the game. I'm just including it because there's some fairly striking parallels there. And because one could look at the stereotyped characters from the Commedia dell'Arte in a similar light to these Jungian archetypes. Why did the plays have such a broad appeal for so long? Probably because their characters are not subtle, but they're very relatable. They are exaggerated personality types. We can see something of ourselves in them. I think it's a principle that continues to be seen into comedy to this very day. Take something like Red Dwarf, for example, where a character like Lister is an exaggerated comic slob, and a character like Rimmer is an exaggerated pantaloon-like control freak. So, that's Jung. I would love to know if Swery happens to see this video, if he was aware of this when incorporating it into the game. I may be reading too much into it, God knows. However, returning to that Slant magazine article which inspired this whole thing, I think it's fair to say that it's not necessary to assume that the Commedia types were included into the game out of empty pretension. I think Swery puts a lot of thought and care into these games, and if they're in there at all, it's quite reasonable to inquire what meaning there could be in them. So, thank you for listening thus far. I know it's been quite a long video, but if you made it this far, I'm very grateful to you. So I'm Eleanor, and this has been Deadly Premonition 2 and Commedia dell'Arte. Hope you found it interesting, and have a great day. Isn't that right, my fairy?